Welcome to Ruins and Haunting Heritage. My name is Dr. April Bisa. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Vassar College, and this is my archaeology seminar for the fall 2020 semester. In this lecture, we're going to cover what is part 3 of the book, Blurring Timescapes, Subverting Erasure. We're skipping over part 2 for a little bit, and then we're going to come back to part 2. And this is not a criticism of the organization of the book, but just trying to hit on certain ideas that are organized for the course syllabus in a certain way. For example, part 3 of this book covers the ghost stories of late modernity, which brings us back to the Harrison and Schofield book, After Modernity, Archaeological Approaches to the Contemporary Past, that we reviewed in week 2. So giving us a refresher, because a lot has happened since then, we're now in week 8. In After Modernity, Harrison and Schofield talk about modernity as the formation of nation states, the industrial production as a form of the world economy, both capitalist and mercantile economies, long-distance communication and trade, and urban and suburban living. So when the world came to this sense of modernity, that this is the way that lives should be lived, economies and politics should be arranged, and this happened around 1950, that the world came to this thing called modernity, we had a separation of what came before with what was going on then and what our ideas of the future was. So with the mass migration of people around the planet, people lost connections to what was their home, their roots, their families, and that caused a loss of the sense of self and a loss of the sense of community and a loss of communal history. And instead, people looked towards nation states through educational systems, through publishing, to learn their own history. The fact that you would pay Ancestry for a DNA test to tell you where you came from, that is only because of modernity and this idea that the future is all that matters, that the past is something that's not really worth holding on to. But if you could find something in the past that will make your future better, then the past is interesting. So modernity is a disconnection from what came before, from local histories, from family histories. Modernity also has this mass consumption in it, that you're going to buy all your furniture from IKEA and you're probably going to throw it out within 5 or 10 years, and you don't really care what it was. It's not hand-me-downs from your ancestors. It's not heirlooms. So late modernity is this current state of post-industrial societies where places like Detroit are falling into ruin because the production is more focused on services, more about restaurants, more about tourism, more about experiences than about what you make. And to be a manufacturer is not considered a good career choice, not considered a good job. So in late modernity, there's this further disconnection towards individuality, towards having your needs met right now, and that other people should give you what you need to survive. Your food comes from strangers, and you're not really sure where your food actually comes from, and that's good, because that means you've made it. That means you're elite. So in late modern societies, knowledge is the primary capital. Manual labor is devalued, and new ideas shape the economy. Think startup companies, think tech companies, all of that. So what that creates, according to Harrison and Schofield, is that in the contemporary past, in the past that happened yesterday, the present is the past at such a pace that what happened this morning is not really of concern of yours anymore. So our sense of the past is distorted through this acceleration of time that we don't think anything is really relevant if it happened in the past because it's over and done with. So they say on page 7 in Harrison and Schofield, as the past appears to recede at an ever-increasing pace, the recent past becomes increasingly distant from individual and collective memory. This means that even the recent past is easily overlooked and quickly forgotten. So this is important for the first chapter that we'll talk about today in Blurring Timescapes, because that chapter is about the 1980s farm crisis in America. And the 1980s was not that long ago, but most people are, what, farm crisis? There was a farm crisis? Oh, didn't know that. And our sense in America about why farms work and don't work is distorted because we've forgotten this farm crisis in the 1980s. So what are the ghosts of that and what lessons they have to tell us? So before we jump into that story in Blurring Timescapes, we want to remember that in Harrison Schofield, what they said that archaeology can do for this late modern time is that it is a metaphor for the recovery of memory. Archaeology can act as both a form of exorcism by bringing to light and casting out those hidden and haunting aspects of the past, and a form of redemption in reconciling communities and nations with recent hidden histories. And the way contemporary archaeology does that, according to Harrison and Schofield, or some of the ways, is that contemporary archaeology breaks down the divisions between the subject, object, researcher, other, us, them. So you don't have to necessarily be a scholar to have scholarly things to say about that time period. It also creates a material witness. When we find objects and sites and we map them on the landscape and we tell the story of here, that's creating a material witness that allows us to develop alternative perspectives. And archaeology also presents to the public that which has been hidden from view. So let's jump to chapter 7, which is authored by Lillian Brislin. And the title of this chapter is Rain on the Scarecrow, Blood on the Plow, Haunting Trauma and the Cruelty of the Agrarian Dream. So if you were alive in the 1980s, and especially if you were over the age of, say, 12 in the 1980s, Rain on the Scarecrow, Blood on the Plow, that is the title of a John Mellencamp song of the same name. So I put a link in the YouTube playlist for week 8 to that song. And you should watch that, and you should think about this chapter, and especially the beginning of the music video where farmers are speaking about what's going on in the 1980s farm crisis. But when you watch the video, you should also look at all of the material culture and all the buildings. And all of the places in that song are probably abandoned, or lots of them are probably abandoned or ruins at this point, or those farms have been purchased by massive corporations and probably have robotic tractors and not necessarily farmers tending the fields. And what late modernity tells us is that's a good thing, that's progress. But a lot of those large equipment is actually compressing the soil and making it harder to actually farm. And so therefore we need more fertilizers and so forth. So there's a lot to be learned about how farming works to understand why organic farming produces such expensive products, and why the small town farmer is a rare thing, unless it's almost a gentlemanly farming from rich people, at least in the area around Poughkeepsie. A lot of our farms are actually horse farms, and those horse farms produce racehorses that make a lot of money for rich people, not as much subsistence farming or farming for the local economy. So at the beginning of that John Mellencamp song, one of the farmers says something to the effect of, people want cheap food, but they don't think about the farmers. So, as I mentioned in the previous video, one of my contributions to this book is that I actually wrote a ghost tour of the book by writing a short ghost story for each chapter, or inspired by each chapter. So the ghost story that I wrote for Rain on the Scarecrow, I actually wrote while sitting in a cafe in Copenhagen in Denmark. And that gave me a slightly different perspective, thinking about America and thinking about places that are very different from America. So when I was writing that ghost story, I went through the chapter and I marked down things that were particularly archaeological from the story that they were telling in there. And I'm just going to give you a list of some of the things that I wrote down as the kind of germination of my ghost story. So we have abandoned farms of the Midwest with crumbling houses that are not too old, but old enough to be creepy. There's doors agape and windows with only shards of glass. There's a rocking chair on the porch where grandmothers used to smile at all of the farm that kept her family firmly within the American dream. The American dream is very much a thing of modernity and not necessarily something of late modernity. There's rusting tools and machinery that reveals the dreams of prosperity that became a nightmare. There's tractors parked in barns that crumble around it. There are scarecrows. There are farmers who hang themselves in barns. There's no murderer except for themselves. Farmers are wearing torn shirts and jeans and seed company hats. And there's a soft sound or a hidden cry or whimper. The barn is a haunted site. It's a concealer, but there's hay that refuses to stop growing on these abandoned farms, even though that hay is now worthless. There's a tractor holding up a barn very stubbornly. There is a sense that you want things to crumble so that they could free the ghosts, but it's not happening. So the farmers left the farms, but the farms remained. And now there's nothing but valueless land that haunts the edges of downtown communities that seem much smaller now. So those were my notes. So here's my actual story. So inspired by Rain on the Scarecrow, Blood on the Plow, Haunting Trauma and the Cruelty of the Agrarian Dream by Lillian Brislin. Driving across the American Midwest can be boring. Architecture is dwarfed by seemingly endless farm fields until a small town appears and disappears almost as fast. If it wasn't for that one downtown traffic light, you may have missed the town altogether. Slower forms of transportation, like a bicycle tour, don't cover great distances, but do give the spirits of past farmers a chance to communicate with you. The haunted farmhouses are not that old, constructed in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. You could recognize them because they are partially hidden by hay that refuses to stop growing. A for sale sign usually marks what is left of the driveway and seemingly invites the curious to witness this loss for themselves. As the house comes into full view, the porch may be seen to contain a worn rocking chair. From here, grandparents used to survey the land that provided for their multi-generational family. The porch is probably sturdy enough for visitors to step inside, and the front door is likely agape, beckoning for someone to witness the loss. The best evidence of what happened here may be found in the kitchen. There hangs a wall calendar that never advanced beyond August 1985, when the farm crisis was at its peak. Pushed to expand their farms from fence to fence, small-time farmers were given loans to grow up as the price of their products sunk to new lows. Many farms succumbed, and some took the neighboring towns down with them. There was no one left to go to church, to school, to the feed store. If you find yourself in an abandoned farmhouse, do not go upstairs. It isn't safe. The broken windows and leaky roof have started the process of returning everything to the land it sprung up from. But before you go, there is something else you need to see. Directly across the road should be what is left of the farmer's barn. If you are lucky, it has already crumbled down around the tractor that refuses to let go of what once was. If the barn is still standing, listen carefully for a gentle whimper before entering. The barns are where some desperate farmers ended their lives, still wearing jeans, t-shirts, and seed company hats that marked them as small-town farmers. Their spirits linger in the barn, but they are too prideful to be seen. Instead, take a look at what is left of their tools, many of which are not yet rusted, but sit unused. These tools, including the tractor and its barn, are too small to be useful to farmers who made the jump to the big time. Bigger is better for some. So I think about this chapter in this ghost story often when I drive around in the Hudson Valley, because there are so many abandoned farms and there are so many barns that are crumbling down. And with those crumbling barns and abandoned farms, there were dreams that people had, that when the government intervened in creating food for the U.S. and international markets, the things that were created for that farm, all of the history that was there was cut off. The American dream says, well, if those were good farmers, they would have been able to make it one way or the other. But when you are given cheap loan after cheap loan after cheap loan, and the price of your product keeps going down, you can't pay it off. So people who were affluent, who did work hard, those farms, those barns that are falling apart, those are the ruins of their dreams. And if you could date a lot of them, a lot of the abandonment is going to be in the 1980s. And not because of progress, but because of the farm crisis. So creating ghost stories and book chapters is an exercise in seeing the ways that people's, places, and events can be held in a social memory that does not care about the linearity of time. Names and dates are just trivia, but the sense of what happened in this place to make it what it is now is of paramount importance. In my story and in all the ghost stories that I've written in here, and in a lot of ghost stories, there are no lies or deceptions. It's just the collapsing of many people's truths into one sensory experience that creates a phenomenology of space. So returning to Harrison and Schofield's methodology for contemporary archaeology, just think about for a minute, did I accomplish those method aspects that they point out that are part of the method of contemporary archaeology? Did I break down the divisions between subject and object, researcher and other, us versus them? Did I create a material witness or develop alternative perspectives? Did I present to the public that which has been hidden from view? So I was inspired by Brislin's work, and therefore I want to make sure I quote from her chapter and give her voice for that. On page 115, Brislin says, "Why are we afraid of ghosts? They unsettle our worldview. They violate our understandings of the absolute division of past and present, of the dead and the living. The ghosts of the 1980s farm crisis haunt the countryside with memories of specific losses. This family's land, her father, our neighbors, but also threaten the dream of the American agrarian good life. We convince ourselves that if we run from ghosts, they might not catch us." So if this farm crisis happened and most Americans don't know about it, and American history has a lot to do with farmers and their own land and this sense of independence, then who are we really if we don't really know what happened? On page 116, Brislin says, "What can listening to the ghosts of the farm crisis offer us?" Donna Haraway observes that mourning is about dwelling with loss, and so coming to appreciate what it means, how the world has changed and how we ourselves change and renew our relationships if we are to move forward from here. Thus, living with ghosts requires agrarian communities to both mourn what was lost and recognize how farmers and farming have changed. Gordon further suggests that we might allow ghosts to help us imagine what was lost that never existed. For U.S. farmers, recognizing what never existed requires questioning the cruel optimism of the modern agrarian dream. It requires abandoning faith in promises that they can find success if they just work hard enough and play the commodity markets right. Such a transformation would require farmers to allow themselves to be possessed by the ghosts of failed farmers and recognize that there is no guarantee they will not meet the same fate. So she ends her chapter with this quote, "Living with ghosts, allowing their stories of loss and redemption to sing through our hopes for the future is crucial to finding that path." So if we learn from the ghosts of our places, we will know and understand what has happened here in a way that will allow us to maybe survive and thrive by knowing why others did not. The next chapter in Blurring Timescapes is a very unique one. It's called Boneyard Quiet, a Ghost Story by A.E. Garrison. Garrison is a sociology professor, but she is also quite the artist. So this chapter is more of a zine or more of a comic book kind of format than most chapters in this book or any academic book would have. So it subverts in itself the usual way that academics tell stories all on its own. But then it is also called Boneyard Quiet, a ghost story, even though it is an academic paper. So Garrisons Story starts with the statement, "There is care to be taken in remembering. Some scholars insist that once an event has a story, a retelling, it is no longer true, no longer a happening, but a story of a story through time." So she says that on page 124. So we tend to criticize stories and that stories are less than knowledge, but stories are how people learn and communicate. So why do we devalue stories when it comes to learning, while we also ensure that within our society, some of our highest paid professions are people who make up stories for our screens and for our ears, for songs, for movies, for TV shows? Stories have value, and to disvalue them in academia is to deny that. So Garrison tells tales of what she found while walking through the city she lived in, Lansing, Michigan. And she did some research to make some more sense of what she saw, and she wove all of this together. So on page 125, she says, "Crumbled bits of other times made by other hands, troubled by the troubles of their lives. Curbs broke in curves to nowhere, and sidewalks from the street went to nothing. What follows is a story of obsession, haunting, and ghosts. I place myself in different times to ask questions that incite the ghosts I have seen to emerge and show themselves to anyone who would seek them out. If they whisper from the shallows and materialize in opacity to tell their stories, what would they tell us?" So she's basically conjuring her own ghosts by looking at the things that don't make sense in her community. She walks around the riverfront and sees the remnants of a bridge that is no longer there. There are sidewalks that end and roads that end in new dead-end signs. And she questions what has happened in her community, that people were once connected by these bridges, by these sidewalks, and by these roads, and why are they no longer connected? So Garrison draws what she saw and weaves those stories together in her ghost story of Lansing. And I wrote my own version of my ghost story from this. And as she said, some scholars insist that once an event has a story, a retelling it is no longer true. So I encourage you to consider both her ghost story and mine as the same tale, but told in a slightly different way. Both are true, yet neither are true at the same time. So my ghost story of hers is much shorter, but hers has all these fabulous illustrations and is much more detailed and much more creative than mine. So here's my version inspired by A.E. Garrison's Boneyard Quiet. In Michigan's capital city, ghosts cry out for the living to pay attention to infrastructure that distances neighboring communities. The city's new rail trail is lovely for those who are walking their dogs or riding their bicycles in the daytime. At night, you can hear ghosts whispering in the wind. Why, they ask, does the trail follow the river, yet rarely cross it? The ghosts themselves stay off the trail because the pavement seems to slither like a pile of snakes. Along the trail's edge, the ghosts gather at ruins. Small piles of stone stick out from seemingly empty fields, asking to be remembered for what they once were, places that mattered. One such pile contains the remnants of a bridge. A link has been severed, but you can still trip over it if you are brave. If not, venture down the trail to Moore's Park. Here, ghosts whisper about the community pool, a gathering place that brought some people together while intentionally keeping others apart. Enforcing pool rules was easier if the undesired did not have a direct path there. Ghosts remember the comfort that the living find in motion. If we keep moving, then we don't have to interact with strangers or confront injustices. The real danger comes when we linger in places we were not meant to be, in places where we are unwelcome. So I'll leave you to read this wonderful chapter to get all of the nuances of what is in that story. But things such as the community pool was actually segregated, and it was certain people were allowed in the community pool and other people were not. And one of the ways to segregate communities is to ensure that roads and bridges and trails don't connect them. So therefore, the rail trail seems beautiful and lovely and wonderful if you are of the proper class to have it go through your communities. But a lot of communities of a different class are entirely disconnected from it because that's not what they were supposed to be. That's not where they were supposed to be. It's actually a form of segregation, that rail trail at the same time. So Garrison ends her comic with some additional commentary, and I especially appreciate this quote from page 141. The knowledge people keep and the stories people share connect us in ways that laws and policies cannot. When information and knowledge is exclusive, the boundaries that benefit power remain in place. Strategies of alienation are just that, practices within ruling regulations that organize everyday experiences. So stories are not less than academic knowledge. Stories are the people's experiences organized by what matters to them. So don't try to prove or disprove a ghost story. Appreciate it as a form of information sharing that we all have access to. I'm going to end this video here and come back with a second part for the other chapters in part 3 of this book.